Hαίrete friends, welcome to Classics in Color, your weekly dive into the ancient world. I'm Mark Graves, let's get started. Let's imagine for a moment a hypothetical scenario where an alien descends to Earth with a very basic, very cursory knowledge of human biology and society and language, but you are entrusted with the task of explaining to this alien stand-up comedy. To make it even more difficult, let's imagine that the alien can't see or hear the same way that we do. So you can't just put them in a comedy show and have them watch it. Instead, all you have is a transcript of a stand-up hour that you can have them read. You might already be able to see where I'm going to go with this when it comes to ancient literature, but indulge me for another moment while we explore this experiment. So let's say you start off by saying, well, stand-up comedy is when one person stands on a stage and tells jokes to a room full of people. That's a solid start, right? Except then you have to define, well, what is a joke? And good luck with that one. I'm not even going to try to touch it. But let's assume that we could come up with a definition of joke that everybody would agree with. Even that wouldn't be quite enough because stand-up comedians don't just tell any jokes, right? You can eliminate knock-knock jokes, the jokes that come on Laffy Taffy wrappers, even the jokes that are in sitcoms, and maybe the flippant one-liners that you get in action movies. Those are kind of different from the jokes that you usually see in a stand-up comedian. There's so many other things we could get into as well, like the audience and the setting. So are we talking about a Netflix special or are we talking about a live mic night at a club in New York? We could talk about the physicality of the performance. So many comedians are running around, jumping, they're acting, miming things out. They're using their microphone and their stool as props. Lots of comedians also incorporate crowd work where they're sort of improvising and vibing off of the audience in real time. We could also talk about the history of stand-up comedy, how it's kind of a modern thing. It doesn't have a ton of history to it. How the biggest scenes for stand-up comedy are currently anyway in New York and LA, maybe London. We could talk about the big names in comedy. So people like Robin Williams, Jerry Seinfeld, Dave Chappelle, and how they've influenced and shaped the genre and people's expectations of it, and how those big names weren't just stand-up comedians, that they did all kinds of other things as well. They were actors and writers and activists, and how people still to this day, when they are writing sets, will often reference famous bits or comedians that have come before them. How many comedians will make fun of comedy or comedians in general, or will ironically say something like, "What's the deal with blank?" Finally, there's the almost insurmountable task of trying to explain all of the culture and history going on outside of comedy, because how many jokes reference current culture, political events, fashion, technology, etc., etc., etc. There's so many jokes that in order to explain to your alien, you'd have to give a whole lecture on with PowerPoints and everything, going through multiple layers of memes and diss tracks and political events. So all of that to try to say that stand-up comedy is what we in my biz like to call a genre. Now, scholars that are vastly smarter than I am are going to be arguing until the end of time, what is a genre? How do we define it? And I am not going to try to do that here. That sounds horrible. But I think we all have a basic, rough, working understanding of what a genre is. You understand that stand-up comedy is different from pop, is different from a musical, is different from a gothic novel. We understand that we have different categories that we put literature and art and music, etc. in. The problem I have as a teacher is that when we look at the genres that were most popular, that we're most engaged in and beloved in the ancient world, are very different from the genres that are most popular and loved in the modern world. So if we pick up a piece of ancient literature, not only are we dealing with all of those historical and cultural and religious differences, but the piece of literature itself is in a genre that has all kinds of different rules and expectations that, unless you have been initiated in, you are completely unaware of. So if you go, no foreplay, just pick up the Iliad, try to read it straight, you will most likely have a very difficult time. You'll be quite lost. And that is not because ancient people were some crazy galaxy brain intellectuals that we will never be able to comprehend. It's just that they're operating within a genre, within a system of rules and expectations that we are not very familiar with. So the job of a good teacher is to try to explain as much of that to you as they can to try to get you in on the joke. One of the problems there is that not all teachers are galaxy brain level heads of their field, internationally recognized scholars, right? I've got 2 degrees in Latin and that's about it. And furthermore, those galaxy brain individuals who are internationally recognized scholars still only have so much access to information. So imagine thousands of years from now, all scholars have is a couple of written transcripts of a few Netflix specials, and then they've got a couple ruined buildings, 2 or 3 cemeteries, and a couple of garbage dumps. And that's all they have to try to reconstruct and understand the year 2022 in the United States of America. Imagine what that would be like. That's kind of the situation that we're in when it comes to understanding the ancient world. Let's look at an example. Let's look at epic poetry. This is arguably, you can fight me on it if you want to, but arguably this is the most important genre in the ancient world. And the first weird thing about it is that it's poetry. So I guess you could argue that modern music, a lot of it is kind of basically poetry, right? Pop and rock and rap, that's all kind of poetry. But when it comes to storytelling, there's almost none of that in poetry. I guess maybe you could argue Dr. Seuss, but that's kind of the exception. In the ancient world, it's kind of flipped. So most or a lot of literature is written in poetry, and prose stuff starts off much more limited and it slowly grows over time. But poetry is sort of the main thing that we start off with. First off, if I say poetry and you're living in modern America, then you are thinking rhyming. And that is never the case in ancient poetry. They actually think rhyming is kind of crass, so they'll actively go out of their way to avoid rhyming. Instead, all of their poetry is what we call metrically based. It's all based on meter, which means you're trying to get a particular rhythm in any line of poetry. So it's all about balancing long and short syllables. It's a little like a haiku in that way. And like a haiku, it's got all of these complex rules that you have to follow, and there are different rules for each genre. So epic and tragedy and comedy and love poetry all have different meters or different systems or rhythms that they're supposed to follow. You might think of poetry as kind of a weird, stilted way to convey a story to someone, but I want you to think for a second about musicals. Let's take Les Mis. Les Mis is a great example of this. So you can convey very serious themes. You can have very serious, tragic things happening on stage that are clearly artificial, right? It's clearly just a person standing on a stage in a costume singing a song about their feelings. None of this would ever happen in real life, but you are still able to suspend your disbelief and buy into the story and feel all of these powerful emotions. It doesn't matter that it's artificial in a ton of ways, it still works. So you can imagine that that would be true of ancient poetry as well. And let's even put musicals aside. Let's think of our favorite dramatic movies. There's so much that is artificial about them that you never notice, it never bothers you. So let's think of things like lighting or of the camera angles. Think about how often you'll get like a close up or a crane shot of something happening. How often do you get a crane shot in your real life, right? And most importantly, music. Music can take an emotional 4 of a scene to an emotional 10. It can make such a huge difference. And a lot of ancient poetry was meant to be recited with accompaniment. There was supposed to be a lyre or something playing along with it, and that's something that we've completely lost. So imagine watching your favorite dramatic movie with the soundtrack completely removed. Also, when I say poetry, you might be picturing, say, reading a sonnet by yourself. And that was not the norm in the ancient world. Silent reading was rare. What you usually would do to experience literature is you would hear it out loud. So people would recite it or read it to each other. So maybe you and your friends might take turns reading something or reciting stuff that you had memorized, or you would have a slave read or recite it to you. So before you had audiobooks and podcasts, we had slavery. So that was the norm, and people were used to and good at reciting stuff. And of course, you would also have people who specialized in reciting and performing these things. That was their whole job. And so they got very good at giving these great performances, and those performances, again, we are completely missing. Poetry and music are amazing memory hacks. Think about how often you have to sing the alphabet song to yourself in order to remember what comes next. Well, before there was the printing press, before there was even writing in the ancient world, what they had was this amazing technology called poetry. That was the main way that they remembered and transmitted information and stories. And so that is a big reason why prose doesn't really become a thing until later, until writing is more common. Earlier on, all that we have surviving is poetry. One really cool thing about this is that when we look at really old poetry that is completely dependent on that oral memory, there's no writing yet, you can see little fossils of that in the poetry. So if you pick up something like the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's got all of these little stock phrases, stock lines, sometimes even whole stock stanzas that are repeating. And it's kind of like if you've ever been to camp and learned camp songs, especially the ones that are really long, they go on and on and on forever. There's usually a lot of repeating lines, a lot of repeating choruses that you keep coming back to keep the song going and keep you remembering it. So the idea is that originally when these songs were being composed and performed, there was a lot more improvisation going on, right? Depending on who was reciting the poem and who their audience was and what the current events were, they had room to improvise and perform and kind of go off script a little bit, but they always had these stock phrases, these stock pieces that they could come back to and keep repeating. So that was a little something about the poetry part of our genre, epic poetry. Now let's look at the epic. Thankfully, in this case anyway, epic is basically what it sounds like. So awe-inspiring, larger than life, mythical, gods and heroes. We're not talking about your average Joe dealing with your average problems. Let's talk about the gods and heroes. So Greeks and Romans are pantheistic. They believe in a whole slew of gods. And another way that they differ from Abrahamic traditions is that they're not interested in dogmas or truth statements, really. So they're totally fine. If you believe in different gods, if we believe in the same gods, but you have different stories about the gods, that's totally fine. Nobody cares. If I believe in an Aphrodite who wears a blue dress and is married to Bob, and you believe in an Aphrodite who wears a green dress and is married to Steve, nobody gives a crap. It's not an issue. And so there come all of these different stories and versions of stories about these gods that all exist at the same time. So if you find any one myth about Zeus, there will be a dozen different versions, different retellings of that same myth. It's in some ways a lot like the comic book universes in that there's Batman, but then there's I don't know how many movies and comic books and video games that all have their particular spin. And maybe they'll come in and say, well, what if Batman was a woman? Or what if we told about Batman when he was a baby and the adventures of baby Batman? I don't know. There's just all different kinds of versions and all of them can coexist at the same time. And while we may debate, which stories are the best stories, we're never going to have the argument of is Adam West Batman or Batman Begins more true. So when Homer picks one story he's going to tell, he says, I'm going to tell the Iliad. He is picking one little chunk out of the whole timeline that is mythology. So again, if we picture scholars in 1,000 years, they're looking back at America 21st century. Let's say out of all the Marvel movies, all they have is Infinity War. So they don't have Endgame, they don't have anything that came after Endgame, they don't have Avengers or Iron Man or any of the stuff that came before and led up into Infinity War. All they have is Infinity War, that's it. That is what the Iliad is. It's this one little chunk out of this massive freaking story. And even out of that one little chunk that Homer is choosing to focus on, this little bit here, there's multiple versions of that. So what he has to do is that down to the one version, the one telling that he wants to tell. Well, my little alien, I hope you had fun learning something about genre in the ancient world. I feel like that sounds a lot fancier than what we just did, but hopefully you had fun, you learned something. Thank you so much for checking out this video. Special thank you as always to subscribers and Patreon members, and I hope to see all of you again next week. Hαίrete.